I was strolling along a quiet road at night after leaving a party, having been left behind by my friend who had chosen a girl over me, when a car suddenly pulled up alongside me. "Get in," now the driver demanded. I stood frozen in shock, my heart pounding. The command was repeated with a hint of urgency as he warned, "Get inside or you're in real trouble." His tone was stern, leaving me little choice. The car doors swung open and I braced myself for the worst. Expecting to see a menacing weapon, I was relieved when I saw nothing but his hand returning to the steering wheel. The seat was left open, and I noticed that he was safely buckled in. There was no immediate sign of danger, and with trees lining the road, I reasoned that I could easily outrun any threat on foot if needed. Years of track training had given me a certain agility. In that brief moment when my mind raced through these details, I heard a sound drawing near, soft, measured, and unlike anything else. I turned instinctively to see a mysterious figure approaching. The creature was hunched over, moving on all fours in a way that defied normal human behavior. Its features were hard to make out in the darkness, yet the silence in its movement was unsettling. One would normally expect some growling or heavy breathing from a predator in pursuit. Yet all I heard were the rhythmic sounds of feet and hands striking the pavement, creating an eerie, silent urgency. I realized that the car offered the only chance for safety and quickly jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. The driver did not waste a moment. He accelerated and we sped away along the dark road. In the side mirror, I could see the strange figure keeping pace, staying only a few steps behind our car. A quick glance at the speedometer revealed that we were already at 70 miles per hour, and as we increased our speed to 80, the figure continued to match our pace with uncanny agility. A sudden discomfort in the back of my seat made me worry that I might unwittingly chosen another dangerous alternative, perhaps an implanted device intended to harm me. The driver's intense focus on the road kept him oblivious to my concern. Leaning forward, I discovered that the object in the seat was nothing more than a small plastic toy, a little army man, with a bayonet that had poked me unexpectedly. After ensuring that the immediate threat from the seat was gone, I turned my attention to the pursuit still visible in the mirror. I asked the driver what was chasing us. He paused, wiping sweat from his face and adjusting his hair, and finally replied in a voice that trembled slightly, "My son." His explanation felt surreal, yet the presence of the toy confirmed his words. Peering into the mirror again, I noted that the creature, although grotesquely deformed and clearly not a normal human, was roughly the size of a child. As my mind processed this unsettling revelation, I instinctively reached for my seatbelt. My fingers brushed against torn fabric where the belt had been roughly damaged during our frantic escape. "He did that when it happened, sorry," the driver explained in a voice that had lost its earlier urgency. We drove along a seemingly endless stretch of road, and with each mile, I became more grateful for his unexpected help. Even if the creature were not behind us, I shuddered at the thought of continuing the journey alone. Hoping to find some clarity in the chaos, I asked him to recount exactly what had occurred with his son. He took a deep breath and began his story. "We were on our way home from his mother's place. I take him Tuesday through Saturday, and we were enjoying the cool night air because my car's air conditioning isn't working. He loved having his hand out the window. Suddenly, about 10 miles back, something extraordinary happened. One moment he was happily waving in the breeze, and the next he was slapping at his neck as if something was causing him pain. I looked over and I couldn't believe my eyes. Out of nowhere, a huge, grotesque creature appeared. It was like a massive, spiky worm with wings. It didn't look just unsettling like a common critter. It appeared determined to cause harm. I know this sounds unbelievable, yet that is exactly how I would describe it." He paused briefly to adjust something at his side, and I noticed bloodstains on his clothing and the faint glimmer of a wound in the moonlight. Despite the evident injury, he continued his story in a calm, almost resigned tone. "After the creature stung him, my son managed to tear off the object that had attacked him. Before I could even ask how he was feeling, I saw him beginning to change. His eyes seemed to melt away, and his facial features drooped until his face looked oddly misshapen. It was a horrifying sight. As he thrashed about, his nails growing sharp and acting like tiny knives, he accidentally slashed in my direction. The car jerked violently as I lost control and was forced to slam on the brakes. I realized this might make me seem unfeeling or callous, but in that moment, the creature that was once his son no longer resembled the child I remembered. In my panic, I tried to kick the creature away as it moved to get closer. The passenger door swung open, and the being tumbled out. It quickly sprang back up, as if it intended to follow me, so I accelerated away immediately. I caught a glimpse of it trying to run, its limbs moving awkwardly as it transitioned into a quadrupedal pursuit. Moments later, our paths intersected. I listened to his account in silence, my blood running cold with each word. I empathized with him, understanding that no one would willingly abandon a child in such circumstances, yet the transformation was too shocking to reconcile with any parental affection. I asked him what he planned to do next, beyond merely driving to safety. His silence told me that shock and grief had rendered him momentarily speechless. We maintained a steady speed of about 85 miles per hour. Although the road was shrouded in darkness, I dared not ask him to slow down, fearful of the persistent threat. Eventually, we neared an intersection that led to the road toward my home. I mentioned this, and we carefully slowed as we approached the turn. Despite being strangers, there was a sense of trust building between us, and I requested that he see me safely home. He agreed without hesitation. As we turned, we passed another vehicle, a family of three whose worried faces quickly registered their concern at our alarming appearance. The ride ended with him dropping me off at a safe location. I thanked him sincerely, both for the ride and for what I believed to be a life-saving intervention, and he departed without further words. Even though my journey had been so short, the exhaustion of the night had already taken its toll, and I fell asleep as soon as I got into bed. The following morning I stopped by a local diner for breakfast, intentionally trying not to dwell on the harrowing events of the previous night. Despite the vividness of the experience, one far too real to be dismissed as a nightmare, I was determined not to let it cloud the start of my day. However, any hope for a quiet morning was soon interrupted. While waiting for my food, I overheard a conversation at the next booth. Two men were talking. One identified himself as a trucker who had been on his route when he encountered emergency vehicles and a tow truck. He described how he had seen a car that appeared severely damaged, its exterior marked by deep cuts, and that three bodies were lying by the roadside hidden under a tarp. I remained silent, my mind reeling as I connected the dots. The family the trucker described was the same family that my mysterious driver and I had passed on our way to safety. The creature that had once been his son had, in a tragic and inexplicable twist of fate, caused harm to innocent lives. Story to the house at the end of the road had been abandoned for years. At least that's what everyone believed. But when Mark woke up inside it, sprawled on a brittle mattress in a room he had never seen before, he knew something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with dust and something else. Something damp, something warm. The walls pulsed, as though alive, expanding and contracting with a slow, sickening rhythm. Shadows moved without a source, whispering his name in hushed, slithering voices. He sat up too fast, his pulse hammering. His last memory was of his own apartment, getting into bed. How had he ended up here? The whispers grew louder, curling around his ears like invisible tendrils. Then they changed. Louder, low guttural wrong filled the air. His breath came in short, uneven gasps as he turned to the door. Something stood in front of it, tall, hunched, watching. The figure shifted, its limbs unfolding in ways that defied nature, cracking and twisting as it rose to full height. The dim light caught its face and marked his stomach drop. It was his face. Mark scrambled backward. Pressing against the pulsing wall, his doppelganger grinned, lips stretching impossibly wide, skin cracking like old parchment. Its fingers twitched, curling inward as if preparing to strike. The bones snapped audibly. No. Stay back. Mark's voice wavered, but the thing only tilted its head, studying him like a predator watching prey. Then, without warning, it lunged. Mark dove aside, barely escaping its grasp. He hit the floor hard, pain jolting up his arm, but there was no time to react. He scrambled toward a second door in the corner, barely a joke. His yanked it open and threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. Darkness swallowed him whole. Panting, he reached out blindly, his fingers meeting rough wooden walls. A closet. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. Silence. Had it given up? Something exhaled behind him. Mark's breath hitched. He couldn't see, but he could feel it. Something was there, breathing, watching. Cold fingers brushed his arm, and he flinched, throwing himself against the door. His fingers clawed for the handle, and the door flew open, and he fell forward. Into the same room, the brittle mattress, the pulsing walls, the creeping shadows, and the thing waiting. Mark gasped, scrambling backward. No, he had escaped. He was sure of it. The creature moved faster now, its limbs bending in sickening ways as it closed the distance. Mark spun around, searching for another exit, but the room had changed. The door was gone. The windows were bricked over. The only light came from an unseen source, casting shadows that twisted and writhed. Trapped. The thing stopped inches away, close enough that Mark could see the cracks in its skin, the hollow depth of its eyes. His own eyes. Its grin widened. Then it spoke. "It's your turn." A pain exploded through Mark's body as its fingers dug into his shoulders. Fire surged through his veins. His screams tangled with the shadows, twisting into the laughter, the whispers, the hum of the house itself. The world split apart. He was falling, sinking, unraveling, and then silence. Mark woke up. Same brittle mattress, same pulsing walls, but something was different this time. The whispers had stopped. A low hum vibrated through the floor, through his bones. He sat up, clutching his arms, his breath caught in his throat. The room was no longer empty. Figures lined the walls, shadowy, hollow-eyed silhouettes like burned imprints on reality itself. They didn't move, they didn't breathe, but they watched. Mark swallowed hard. "Who are you?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. One figure stepped forward, its form flickering like a dying flame. "We were like you." Mark's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Another figure rasped, its voice scraping through the air. This house, it keeps its on us, we become part of it, but Mark clenched his fists. No, I can get out. There has to be a way. The first figure tilted its head. Maybe. But every time you try it gets harder. The house changes. It learns. His pulse pounded in his ears. He refused to accept this. He scanned the room for any way out. But the walls pulsing were now solid as stone. Then a voice whispered. Not from the figures. Not from the house. From not alone. You're not alone. For the first time, Mark felt something different. Defiance. The walls shifted, revealing glimpses of something vast, something beyond comprehension. The house was more than a house. It was a membrane between worlds, a doorway, and the entities beyond it were not bound by time or space. They watched, waiting, and as Mark stared into the shifting void, he understood escape was never an option. Something ancient stirred beyond the walls, a force older than stars, whispering through the folds of existence. It burrowed into his mind, warping his thoughts, twisting his memories. The figures around him weren't just victims. They were echoes, fragments of something larger, bound in an endless cycle. Mark clenched his jaw, resisting the pull. He would not be another lost soul trapped in the house's embrace. The house had learned, but so had he. He reached deep inside himself, searching for something real. And then he ran. Not through a door, not through the walls, but into the shadows themselves, into the cracks where reality had begun to break. As he plunged into the darkness, the house laughed. The thing beyond laughed. His own voice split into infinite versions of itself. And then he was gone. The house at the end of the road had been abandoned for years, or so everyone thought. But inside, something else had awakened. Story 3. James had always driven past this stretch of road without a second thought. It was just trees, empty fields, and silence. Until today. A town stood where there had never been one. Quaint homes lined the streets, their windows glowing with warm, golden light. Cobblestone roads wove through the heart of it, yet something was off. The sign at the entrance read, Hearthbrook, Population 1. His foot hesitated on the gas pedal. He wasn't one for detours, but something in the back of his mind whispered that he should stop. That he had to stop. Sarah, his wife, glanced at him nervously. James, she asked, her voice soft with concern. What's wrong? A cold prickle ran down his spine. He couldn't quite place it, but the air felt heavier now. Something about this town was wrong. The car door creaked as he stepped out, and the moment his feet touched the ground, an overwhelming sense of dread swept over him. James, what's happening? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling beside him. Hours earlier, they'd stopped at the last gas station for miles. The old man at the counter barely looked up as James paid for gas and coffee. Best not go down Route 66 this late. The man muttered, eyes fixed on something behind James. Things ain't right past the cornfields. James had laughed it off. Cornfields were always eerie at night, but as they drove, the fields seemed taller, the stalks twisting unnaturally in the breeze. His headlights flickered as something darted between the rows, too large, too fast. His radio buzzed with static. A voice, barely a whisper, crackled through turnback. His hands tightened on the wheel. The gas station faded in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the endless road. Then the car sputtered, the engine coughed, then died. No warning lights, no explanation. He coasted to the side of the road, gripping the steering wheel. The fields loomed beside him, rustling with movement that wasn't the wind. James, we're out of gas, Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. He cursed under his breath. They were stranded in a place he couldn't even remember passing. The gas gauge had been fine just moments ago. They were stuck, and that feeling of dread only grew stronger. The town of Hearthbrook gleamed ahead, its streetlights flickering like dim stars. His breath came faster now. He took a step back. The air thickened. Something pungent, something rotten, curled into his lungs. The people, if they were people, started toward him. Their feet didn't touch the ground. Their bodies drifted forward, their smiles never faltering, their eyes never blinking. This place had never existed, but somehow it had always been waiting for him. He blinked, and the buildings were closer. The sky had darkened, an unnatural shade of deep gray tinged with sickly purple veins. A hum reverberated through the cobblestones, gnawing at the base of his skull. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching for him. He stumbled backward, expecting the ground to hold firm. It didn't. The earth beneath him pulsed, like he was standing on something alive. The townspeople, or whatever they were, began to whisper. Their words didn't make sense, but they burrowed into his mind, filling his thoughts with static. They whispered of home, of belonging, of eternity. James, Sarah murmured, tugging at his arm. We have to get out of here. But they turned quickly, seeking an escape, and spotted an old house at the end of the street. Desperate, they hurried toward it. A hunched old man and his wife stood on the porch. Their eyes, dull and sunken, seemed to bore into James and Sarah. The air around them was thick, stagnant. The man's voice was rough, like dry leaves. Cornfields, wrong. Something's wrong with them. He gestured toward the horizon, where the cornfield stretched far beyond the town. The woman nodded slowly. People used to come here, for help, but no one leaves. James swallowed hard, looking toward the darkening fields. In the distance, he saw movement, shadows weaving through the corn, too deliberate to be the wind. Are you saying people are being sacrificed? James asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old couple exchanged a glance. Their lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. Not sacrificed. The man said, his voice softer. Joined. The ground beneath them seemed to shudder, and the sky darkened further. The air grew oppressive. James felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. Behind them, a door opened, and another man appeared, older than the first, with a twisted smile stretching unnaturally wide. Time's up, he said, as though to no one in particular. James' heart raced. They needed to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The town was closing in. Without warning, they turned and sprinted down the street. The cobblestones beneath their feet seemed to twist, trying to hold them in place, but they kept running, desperate to escape. The whispers of the townspeople grew louder, blending with the sickening hum of the earth beneath them. Suddenly, the door to a new building appeared out of nowhere, an unexpected way out. James grabbed Sarah's hand. Without hesitation, they crossed the threshold, leaving the nightmarish town behind. Sound collapsed, the whispers silenced. James stood in an empty room, the door now gone. The walls were covered in pictures, his pictures, every stage of his life from childhood to now, even moments that had never happened, yet they were framed in glass. A calendar hung by the door, the date was blurred. The ink swam across the paper, refusing to be read. He reached out to touch it, and the walls groaned. Behind him, the door was gone. In its place stood a mirror. In the reflection, the town of Hearthbrook watched him back. The streets bustled once more, filled with the silent, grinning people. His own reflection stood among them, smiling just as wide. His voice joined the whispering chorus. Welcome home. James grabbed Sarah's hand, and they ran. The streets stretched endlessly before them, a maze that refused to give them an exit. The air thickened with each passing second, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They were closing in. A door appeared on the left, just as they thought they had reached a dead end. It stood ajar, inviting them in. James knew better than to trust it, but desperation pushed him forward. They crossed the threshold, their hearts pounding. The door slammed shut behind them. Darkness swallowed the room, but the oppressive hum of the town outside remained, vibrating through the walls. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. They stood in a small, barren room. No windows, no exits. Just four walls, a rickety table in the center, and a single chair facing the corner. Suddenly, a low, mournful sound filled the air. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the earth, it was something else. A voice, soft, familiar, echoed through the room. James. Sarah's breath hitched. She turned toward him, eyes wide with fear. Did you hear that? James nodded, unable to speak. The voice, it was his own, or something that sounded like him, but twisted hollow. Another voice joined in, distant and agonizing. Sarah, help. They froze, bodies rigid with fear. The whispers of the town outside grew louder, now melding with the voices, his and Sarah's, calling to them from every direction. Suddenly, the room seemed to bend, the walls distorting as though the space itself was warping. The floor beneath them pulsed, alive, like the heartbeat of something ancient and malevolent. A shadow moved in the corner. It grew, stretching and curling like smoke, forming into a figure. No, reflections, their own reflections, standing not behind them, but in front of them, grinning with eyes full of hunger. The reflection of James spoke first, his voice cold and warped. You've been here before, James. We've always been waiting. The reflection of Sarah smiled, her face twisted. Time to join us? The floor trembled. Shadows crept closer, wrapping around their feet, pulling them toward the darkness. Their bodies, heavy with dread, refused to move. The mirror on the far wall rippled, showing the town outside, still alive, still watching. The same twisted smiles of the townspeople peered through, their eyes filled with hunger. Join us, the reflection of James whispered. Welcome home. The darkness in the room began to consume everything. The walls seemed to close in, the voices growing louder and louder. The air thickened, suffocating them, and just as they were about to lose themselves completely, the world fractured. The mirror cracked. With a sound like glass shattering, the world splintered apart. But this time, they weren't alone in the void. The twisted townspeople emerged from the cracks, skeletal hands reaching for them. James and Sarah screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the darkness. The mirror shattered. James and Sarah stood frozen in the darkness, their bodies unmoving as cracks spread across the mirror. Twisted faces of the townspeople reached through, their hollow eyes burning with insatiable hunger. Their hands stretched toward them, fingers curling in desperate anticipation. Then the ground beneath their feet began to shift, pulsing with an unsettling rhythm. The darkness swirled around them, twisting into unnatural shapes. The town's whispers faded into a low hum, and for a brief moment everything seemed to still. But then, the silence shattered. A grinding sound, like ancient gears turning, echoed through the air. An alien hum that vibrated deep in their bones. It was no longer just the town closing in. It was the very fabric of reality unraveling at its seams. Their bodies trembled as a dim, cold light flared in the distance. This light wasn't like the warm glow of Hearthbrook's cobblestone streets, nor the sickly purple of the sky. It was a light that felt outside of the universe, something vast and incomprehensible. Then, the walls around them stretched, warping into an endless abyss. Shadows in the corners of the room grew long, twisting like serpents, no longer bound by space or time. Sarah's voice echoed through the emptiness, twisted and distant. James, are you seeing this? The reflections of James and Sarah no longer grinned. Instead, their eyes were wide with terror. In their gazes, James saw the knowledge of something far more dreadful than Hearthbrook itself. The shadows began to speak, no longer just whispers but voices resonating with the very vibrations of the universe. At first, the words were unintelligible, but slowly they formed coherent thoughts in James's mind. You were never meant to leave Botch. The universe is a cycle, repeating itself endlessly. See, your souls are always part of it, beyond life, beyond death, beyond time. I sent then. James felt a pull, not just on his body but on his very essence. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The world around him stretched and folded, collapsing into something too vast for his mind to understand. Sarah screamed. Her voice was torn from her lips, like the sound of 1,000 shattered stars. She was being pulled away, her figure distorting as if she were being absorbed into the very fabric of space. Then James understood. This place wasn't just a town, it wasn't just a nightmare. Hearthbrook was an anchor, a focal point at the center of the cosmic web where realities converged, and the threads of existence twisted together into an eternal knot. As the walls of the room shattered completely, James felt himself falling, not downward but outward, stretching across an infinite expanse. The town of Hearthbrook dissolved, its final remnants slipping into nothingness. And then he saw it. The cosmos, vast and cold, spread out before him. Stars burned with unnatural light. Galaxies spun in a spiral dance, each trapped in its own cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Time flowed like a river, yet everything remained timeless. James wasn't just in space, he was part of it. His body, mind, and soul were merging with the very fabric of reality. And then he realized they had always been part of it. Welcome home, the voices whispered, not just the townspeople, but something much older, much more ancient. James felt Sarah beside him, her hand still clutched in his. Though her body was no longer human, she was an energy, a light, a spark of something eternal. Together they floated in the cosmic sea, unable to distinguish where their bodies ended and the universe began. Then the truth settled in. There was no escape, no beginning, no end. They were part of the infinite cycle of existence, forever lost, forever found. Welcome home. The voices repeated, their chorus echoing across the universe. And then, James and Sarah were nothing more than whispers in the dark. Story 3 Cedar Hollow had always been a peaceful town, quiet and tucked away in the hills, with sprawling farms and little more than dirt roads to connect its handful of residents. People said it was a good place to raise children, and some of the older folks swore by the deep, rich soil. But there was always something off about the land around here, something that didn't sit right. And in the fall, when the harvest came in, that sense of unease grew heavier. Hannah, a young woman in her mid-20s, had recently moved to Cedar Hollow. After the collapse of her marriage and a failed career in the city, she needed to start over. The town was quiet, and she found peace in the rolling hills and the thick woods that lined the edge of the farmland. A local farmer, Robert, had offered her a small cottage on his property for a low rent, and she had accepted, eager to escape the noise of her former life. It was a beautiful place, too, surrounded by fields of corn and pumpkins, the trees dense with shadows, and the distant hum of the nearby creek. Robert was kind enough, though a little distant, and she had no complaints about the solitude. The days were quiet, filled with the sounds of nature, the wind rustling through the cornstalks, the distant call of a hawk, and the occasional chatter of squirrels. It was everything she had hoped for, but as the weeks wore on, things began to feel strange. The old farmhouse had creaky floors, and the doors groaned like they had stories to tell. The quiet seemed to press in around her at night, and sometimes when she would go out to check the fields at dusk, there was an unsettling feeling, like someone was watching her from the tree line. Every time she turned, the sensation would vanish, but it always felt like something was there lingering. One late afternoon, as the orange light of sunset fell over the fields, Hannah was walking back from the barn when she saw something peculiar, a figure, standing at the edge of the woods near the farthest field. It was tall, its body wrapped in something dark, maybe a coat or a cloak, but it was hard to tell from that distance. She thought she saw it move, but by the time she got closer, it was gone. She chalked it up to the rustling of the trees, or maybe an animal passing through, but the feeling of being watched grew worse. A few days later, after a long day of picking pumpkins and sorting the harvest, Hannah came inside the cottage to find that someone had been in her house. The door, which she'd locked before leaving, was wide open. Her things had been disturbed. Drawers open, the blanket on her bed thrown off. Nothing seemed to be missing, but there was something wrong about the way everything had been touched, moved, as if someone had been looking for something. Her heart pounded in her chest as she checked every room, but she found no one, just the oppressive silence. That night, she locked the door again, doubled, checked the windows, and climbed into bed, trying to shake off the growing paranoia. But then, just as she was drifting to sleep, a low, rasping sound reached her ears. It was coming from outside. She slowly got up, her feet cold against the wooden floor. The sound, it was rhythmic, like something dragging across the ground. She crept toward the window, her breath held tight in her chest. There, in the moonlight, was the figure again, standing at the far edge of the field. But now it was closer, too close, and it was dragging something behind it. A long, slick trail of something. She couldn't make out what it was, but it was disturbing. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she watched the figure move slowly toward the house, dragging that dark, unnatural trail behind it. She felt sick, her body frozen with fear. Then the figure stopped. It seemed to be staring right at her window, and in that moment she was certain it could see her, could sense her watching. A wave of pure terror washed over her, and she scrambled backward, slamming the blinds shut. She bolted the window, every instinct screaming to lock herself inside and never leave. But as the night passed, she didn't sleep. She stayed awake, listening to the creaks of the house and the strange, dragging sound that seemed to draw nearer. The next day, when Robert came by to check on her, she tried to act normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Robert seemed a little off himself, his eyes dark, his movements slow. She asked him about the figure in the field, but he just smiled that unsettling smile of his, too wide, too forced, and said it was probably just a neighbor. People out here do odd things, he said. Don't worry about it. But she couldn't shake the sense that he was hiding something. That night, the dragging sound returned. This time, she didn't dare look outside. She stayed in her bed, clutching the blanket, her mind racing. But the sound didn't stop. It dragged on, and then, slowly, the door to her cottage creaked open. A soft whisper filled the room. "Hannah, come outside." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. The whisper came again, this time louder and closer, until it was just on the other side of the bed. "Hannah, we've been waiting for you." Then the door slammed shut, and the house went silent. The next morning, Robert came to find her, but she was gone. The door was unlocked, and there were muddy footprints leading from the cottage to the fields, where they disappeared into the tall corn. The search party combed the area, but there was no sign of Hannah, no sign of a struggle. The only thing they found was a small, twisted trail of broken corn stalks leading into the woods. The air was thick, the smell of something rotten hanging in the air. Days later, Robert confessed. He wasn't just a farmer. He was part of an old rural cult that had been around for generations in Cedar Hollow. People who had lived off the land in ways that were beyond the ordinary. Every year during the harvest, they made offerings to something in the woods, something that required a sacrifice. The harvest was never complete without it. They had been waiting for her, watching her. She had always been the one. But she was never meant to leave. Hannah's body was never found. But every fall, when the harvest begins, the townspeople in Cedar Hollow whisper of strange things in the woods. And sometimes, just before the sun sets, there is a dragging sound, like something being dragged through the fields. No one dares to go into the woods anymore. The Appalachian mountains were timeless. Ancient hills draped in endless green, rivers that murmured through the valleys like whispers from another age. The town settled within them was small, quiet, the kind of place where the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and the nights stretched long and unbroken. But something was wrong. Something unseen, waiting beneath the surface of that picturesque tranquility. I woke up in suffocating darkness. The air was thick, stale, an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest, pinning me beneath something heavy. Bags, boxes, objects I couldn't identify. My breath came short and uneven. I tried to move, but space was against me. The metal walls closed and the fabric of the car's interior rough against my skin. I was in the back of a vehicle, and SUV, a van, I couldn't tell. My body was wedged awkwardly, my left side crushed against cold metal, and then I saw a hole, jagged and irregular, torn through the wrecked trunk door. Through that gash in the metal, I could just barely glimpse the outside world, and I knew exactly where I was. I was in my real parents' driveway, my home. The place I belonged was just beyond that wall of metal. Safety was so close, just a few feet away, yet impossibly out of reach. The realization made my breath hitch. If I could just scream, if I could just move, someone might hear me. But it wasn't the world I knew. Darkness stretched beyond that opening, a suffocating void. Not just the absence of light, but something deeper. Something wrong. A dim glow flickered above, weak, sickly. The porch light of a house I could barely make out. It cast faint shimmers onto another car, its sleek black form parked just in front of me, blocking me incompletely. Even if someone had wanted to free me, they would have to move that vehicle first. But no one would. The silence pressed in like a living thing, heavy and expectant. Then, movement. A man passed by. I saw him through the hole in the wrecked trunk, his figure just a shadow against the night, draped in black. His gait was slow, deliberate, predatory. I couldn't see his face, but something in me knew. he had just killed someone. The certainty of it crawled beneath my skin, settling into my bones like ice. My breath hitched. The weight of the vehicle, the trapped sensation, the black void beyond the hole, it all pressed into my mind like a vice. I tried to move, to shift even slightly, but the crushing pressure wouldn't let me. Then I blinked, and I was somewhere else. The dim warmth of my grandmother's house surrounded me, but it felt wrong. Like an imitation, a place that had been reconstructed from memory but lacked something vital. The walls seemed too far away, the air too still. She sat across from me in a power recliner, her voice distant, muffled. I could barely make out what she was saying. Then Felix entered. I barely saw him, barely saw anyone from that side of the family. We had no real connection, no real reason to be close. I lived with my real parent. That had always been enough. Yet now here he was kneeling in front of me, locking eyes with mine, searching. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hold onto, words that slipped from memory the moment they reached my ears. I tried to focus, to grasp onto whatever he was saying, but it was like trying to remember a dream as you wake up. The harder I tried, the faster it dissolved. Then another shift. I was back in the van. This time it was different. The seats had been stripped away. I was no longer confined in the trunk, but in the middle of the empty space, sitting on cold. The metal sliding door was open, allowing the warm, humid air to seep in. Beyond it they stood. A crowd gathered outside, their faces illuminated in the dim porch light. Family. Step family. Strangers. A sea of people I had no reason to see, people who shouldn't have been there. Aunts, uncles, cousins I had never met. They stood in an eerie circle, unmoving. "It's your birthday," someone said. No, that wasn't right. It was warm, the air thick with the scent of damp grass and earth. But I was born in December. It should have been snowing. I hadn't invited them. I never would have. And yet they were here, staring as if they had always belonged, as if they had been waiting for me. A child sat beside me. I had never seen him before, yet something about him sent a sickening chill up my spine. He was too still, his eyes too dark, too deep. "Sing," one of the adults urged him. He didn't sing. His mouth opened, but what came out wasn't a song. It wasn't words, it was something else. A guttural, writhing sound slithered into the air. An incantation, a chant that felt like it was pulling at the seams of reality itself. His voice was layered, unnatural, shifting tones that no human voice should have been able to produce. The others joined in. Their mouths moved in unison, their voices merging into a sound I couldn't comprehend, alien, ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. The space around me rippled. The air thickened, pressing against me like invisible hands. The van, the driveway, the house, everything became distant, distorted, as if I were slipping through the cracks of existence itself. My vision blurred, my thoughts scrambled. The weight of something unseen bore down on me. Then nothing. No light. No sound, no sense of self. Only the memory of the killer's shadow, of being trapped, of the cold metal of the car pressing into my skin, and the sound of that language, that unearthly, mind-breaking language, whispering in my skull long after I woke up.